Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa usalli wa usallam ala Sayyid al-Awwaleen wal Akhirin Nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wa sallam. My beloved brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On behalf of the Islamic Institute of Toronto, I take this pleasure in welcoming you to another session in Islamic History Month, this year 2020. In the past, alhamdulillah, we were able to meet together in the Islamic Institute's center. We were shoulder to shoulder. We learned about Islam in different parts of the world. We ate the food. We looked at the dress. We studied the history. Today, we're living in a pandemic. But alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the ability to continue on in a virtual form. And so today's session, by Brother Hassam Munir, who is the founder of iHistory and a Canadian historian. Today's session will be dealing with Black Canadian Muslims. Alhamdulillah, Brother Hassam has been doing excellent work, and it is an honor and a privilege to have him here with us for this very important session. So I leave you in peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Hassam Munir, and I'm very happy to be presenting today and discussing the history of Black Muslims in Canada. And before I go into that, I just hope everyone is doing well, that you're staying safe, that you're staying healthy, and in these very difficult circumstances that we are all collectively enduring, that you are making the best of all the opportunities, and that we're all able to be fully grateful for all the blessings that we continue to enjoy, including the blessing of knowledge and the ability to learn and the ability to develop our sensitivity and our understanding on certain topics, so that when we see certain events happening in the world around us today, we can make more informed decisions. We can take more educated positions on particular topics that may be contentious or that may be difficult to understand. And I believe that the history of Black Muslims in Canada is certainly a topic that all Canadians, and particularly Canadian Muslims, should be very familiar with. And that's why I want to take advantage of this session and give you an introductory run-through and a non-exhaustive run-through, but it's just sort of to get our minds thinking about this topic. So before I go into the chronological history of Muslims in Canada itself, I think there's a few things for us to keep in mind. The first thing is that I grew up in Toronto. I grew up here in Canada, and when we go through the elementary school system and the secondary school system, we are taught about certain aspects of Black history. And especially during Black History Month growing up, I can remember there were a lot of events, and posters would be put up, and we would have assemblies and things of that sort. But one thing that was very noticeable and very obvious was that the people we were learning about were often people who were, Black, but they were from the United States, and from the United States context in particular. And but at that age, maybe you don't particularly pay attention, although this is a point that teachers as well as curriculum developers and others need to revisit and come back to the table and think about why there is this sort of erasure of Canada's own very rich and very long-standing, almost 400 years or so of Black history in this land. And growing up, it continued. So, when we get to high school, the novel that we are, taught to read or encouraged to read, supposedly because it helps us develop our sensitivity towards racial issues and challenges, is Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. And again, this is in Canada, and we are, reading a novel that is set in Alabama, and, it's not that there's nothing to learn from it or that it's not relevant, and that's a separate discussion. But the point I'm trying to make is where are the Canadian stories? Where are the stories of Black Canadians? where is the history of the black community within this country. And I also don't want to set a particularly nationalistic frame on history. I think there's certain, risks with that and certain disadvantages that come with that. But at the same time, it's almost as if by discussing this history, we're moving away from the nationalistic frame, actually, because we want to see the interconnections across North America and make sure that when we speak about black history and the black diaspora in North America, it's not just the United States. It's also places in the Caribbean, it's also Mexico, and it's certainly also Canada. So, that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that we should not limit ourselves strictly to black Muslim history. When, in the Muslim community we have these conversations, we need to broaden our focus and broaden our scope and learn black history in general, not just black Muslim history. And the reason for that is that there has been so much erasure in general of black history in Canada. We have 400 years of black history in this land, like I mentioned, but because the peoples of African descent, many of whom came from West Africa, many of whom came to Canada, to the United States through the transatlantic slave trade, and many of them were either of Muslim background, or they were actually Muslim, or they may have been Muslim, or they had some connections to Afro-Islamic cultures, or there are movements or people who were not Muslim but they were inspired by Islam. So there's many different kinds of interplays here between Islam, the Islamic identity, as well as the black experience in general within North America. So that's something that I think points us in the direction of let's study black history in general in North America and particularly in Canada. And I'm going to mention a few resources that will help guide you toward that. One of them is, first of all, knowing Matthew de Costa, who in the early 1600s, exactly about 400 years ago, was in Canada, the first free black person known to have lived in Canada. So that's a name that we should always be mindful of. Then there's the period of slavery, and as Dr. Afua Cooper, who is a prominent scholar of the history of slavery within Canada, says very emphatically that slavery is Canada's best kept secret. It did happen here. It had particular forms here and particular dynamics associated with it, and we can't just have this view that this land and this country has been a post-racial society or something along those lines, which is very prevalent. It's a very prevalent kind of belief, but there's certainly racial challenges and racism today, and there has been for a long time in this land as well, and that's something for us to address. And so I would recommend reading, just to contextualize that conversation, Dr. Afua Cooper's book, which is called The Hanging of Angelique, and the subtitle of the book is The Untold History of Slavery in Canada and the Burning of Old Montreal. And it's a very fascinating book about a young black woman who was enslaved in Montreal, and she was accused of starting a fire in the mid-1700s, which burned down about 40 buildings in Montreal. So it's a fascinating survey of the history of slavery in Canada. And it's also a fascinating story of that woman in particular. And the last thing I will say is, just living in the time that we are living in, there's a lot you can learn just from a quick Google search. Now, just a disclaimer, I'm not saying let's Google something and immediately believe everything we see. We should use our critical thinking skills, our comprehensive reading skills, and we should develop those skills so that we can enable ourselves to learn. But if you search, the history of black people in the Yukon, or the history of the black community in Toronto, there are some fascinating articles, there are some fascinating videos on YouTube in which experts are cited, and clearly an effort has been made to document this history. And there's a lot you can learn, and there's a lot we can learn together by just making an effort from time to time to, cumulatively educate ourselves by reading maybe like one article a week or something like that. So we develop a strong understanding of the history of Black people within Canada. And with that, with those sort of introductory kind of comments, I'm going to move into the actual history. As much of it I have been able to piece together. Again, like I mentioned, it's not exhaustive. There may be many other things out there that we don't know, and I hope, inshallah, we will one day not only uncover, but also play a role, that Muslim scholars will play a role within uncovering that history and sharing it within our communities and with the broader Canadian society. But there are, I think, many examples that we can discuss, and there's a lot to learn from them. And inshallah, now we are going to go right into that. So the history of Black Muslims in Canada starts with people who we know were from Muslim backgrounds in West Africa, which is where they originally came from, but we don't necessarily know that at the times that they were present in what is now Canada, we don't know if they were still adhering to the Islamic faith, but they were certainly of Muslim background. So this is why I mentioned that point earlier about why we should study Black history generally, because we may be reading stories of people who were and there's a high possibility that they were Muslim, despite actually not knowing for sure whether they were Muslim or not. So I'm going to start with one particular story of a person named Richard Pierpoint, who was from West Africa, from Bondu, which is now in Senegal. He was enslaved in 1760, so this is very early on. And he was brought as a slave to Connecticut, and then over the years he was moved to New York, and in 1775 the American Revolutionary War broke out. So of course this was a war between those who were trying to declare a country known as the United States independent of Britain and the British colonial rulers themselves. And what the British colonial authorities offered many slaves was the possibility of, obtaining their freedom from enslavement by fighting for the British. And so Richard Pierpoint was one of these people who chose to take that particular deal and fought for the British in 1775. And as the American Revolution unfolded and the British forces had to retreat, Richard Pierpoint and the people he was fighting alongside had to retreat back into the British stronghold, which is, of course, now known as Canada. And particularly their barracks were located in Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is still, as we know, a part of Canada right next to the famous Niagara Falls. And so, that war, essentially, that conflict created the basic of the states that we know today as Canada and the United States. Now, Richard Pierpoint was in Canada, of course, and he was actually given land as a reward for his services by the British colonial authorities in what is now St. Catharines, Ontario, and he was given several hundred acres of land, with the idea being and the implication being, of course, that they could have this land as long as they cleared it of the forestry, and as long as they started to farm it and essentially settle this land. And Richard Pierpoint slowly took on sort of a leadership position within this very early community of free Black settlers. And of course, they were no longer enslaved, but they still faced discrimination and prejudice. And one of the things that Richard Pierpoint led his community, the other Black settlers in southern Ontario, in petitioning the government, and in particular Lieutenant Governor Sir John Graves Simcoe, was to allow them to have all of their land that they had been awarded adjacent to each other, right next to each other, so they could form their own sort of enclave in the St. Catharines area. This petition was rejected, and of course they continued to develop community in other ways. And it's said about Richard Pierpoint's land in what is now St. Catharines, Ontario, that it was a sort of hub for not only the African settlers in the area, the black settlers, but also the indigenous people whose traditional trails, their hunting trails, actually ran through much of his land. So there was a lot of interesting interactions we can imagine happening, although we don't have any firm evidence of this. And moving on, then the War of 1812 happens, and by this time, Richard Pierpoint is quite aged, and by that time he had also sold his land in St. Catharines and moved to what is now Hamilton, Ontario, and he was sort of living there, and he took part in the War of 1812, and the places that him and the Black Corps in the War of 1812 fought and served for Canada in defense against the United States are very familiar places, right? So we need to associate places with the history and the stories that we know about them. So Burlington Bay and Stony Creek, etc. These are familiar names to us. So the War of 1812 happens. They fight in that war as well. And once again, after that war, Richard Pierpoint, who's quite aged at this point, actually petitions the government again, this time to allow him to return home to West Africa. But of course, the settlers and their labor is something that the government of British North America at the time is benefiting from. So what they decide to do is reject his petition to be sent home to West Africa, which he still considers his home, and instead they give him land in a very small town called Fergus, Ontario, just outside of Guelph. And he's the first settler in that town. So we can still go today and visit Fergus, Ontario. And he's the first settler in that region. And again, he clears the land, and a community starts to develop around him. And to some extent, there are black families that are still in Guelph who, retell the stories that they originally heard from Richard Pierpoint, because one of the things he did in his advanced age was he became a sort of traditional West African storyteller for the black people settling in the Gulf region and other parts of southern Ontario, and he would share those traditional stories, and perhaps we don't know some Islamic stories as well, and many of those stories have been passed down for families who have been in the region for a very long time, from generation to generation. So this is all happening in the 1700s, in the early 1800s, so it's very early on, and Richard Pierpoint, again, who was of Muslim background and possibly may have been Muslim and may have preserved his Muslim faith even despite nominally changing his name to the name that was required, just to survive in this system of enslavement. And he passed away in 1838 here in Canada. And in 1796, there was a ship full of Maroons. Now, Maroonage is a concept mostly from the Caribbean and from the enslavement period. And the Maroons, especially on the island of Jamaica, there's a particular association of, the enslaved of Muslim background and Maroonage. And what Maroonage essentially means is the slaves would run away and come together, a group of runaway slaves, and essentially have their own community that they formed as runaway slaves. And because they had strength in numbers when they came together, they were able to sort of resist efforts to re-enslave them and things of that sort. So Jamaica has a history of the Maroon Wars, of lots of conflicts involving these Maroons, and a lot of association that with the Muslims who were enslaved in Jamaica, that they were particularly prone to taking part in this kind of system. So, part of the solution that was developed by the British colonial authorities was uprooting the Maroon sort of community. So in 1796, one ship full of Maroon men and women was deported from Jamaica and actually sent to Halifax in Nova Scotia. And for the next 4 years, these people who were they were Maroons, they developed their own small community on the outskirts of Halifax, and they lived there, and then they were deported again to Sierra Leone. And this is very interesting because the country of Sierra Leone in West Africa has a particular history of Islam, and a particular history of repatriated slaves who were given their freedom and resettled in West Africa. And many of them, were Muslim or embraced Islam when they were there. The exact, trajectory of events isn't very clear often. So we have Halifax, Nova Scotia in the 1790s as this middle point. We know there was Maroonage and Muslims in Jamaica. We know there were Muslims in Sierra Leone among those who were repatriated. And we know that at least one ship full of those people were in Halifax in Nova Scotia in the late 1790s. So this gives us some indication that there may have been a Muslim presence there as well. And now moving into the period where slavery begins to be abolished, and of course in 1833 it was abolished across the British Empire, and Canada included, and that's when in the mid 19th century, in the mid 1800s, we start to see the Underground Railroad develop, right, which ultimately helps about 300,000 enslaved people in the United States, where slavery was still legal. It helped them escape slavery and come to Canada. But the one particular story that I want to mention is very interesting. Again, a person of Muslim background, and noticeably a person who chose to keep his Muslim name, even though we know for a fact that across the system of enslavement in the Western Hemisphere, there was this immense pressure that the enslaved faced to actually change their name. So his name remained Muhammad Bakuaqua, and we can see in that first name, Muhammad, like a clear kind of pronunciation of a very Muslim name of Muhammad, right? And he was certainly, we know from his own autobiography that he was of Muslim background. He was brought as a slave to Brazil in the early 1800s. And then very interestingly, he was part of a coffee shipment that was taken by ship from Brazil to New York City. And in New York City, slavery had been banned, and there was a network of communication among slaves, and they often, passed around information to each other. So Bakuaqua was aware that slavery had been prohibited in New York City. So as soon as he sort of got to New York City into the harbor, he actually jumped ship and swam to shore and declared himself a free person. And of course, there was tensions, and he faced some time in arrest, and the abolitionist movement sort of helped him escape, and he went to Haiti. And then from Haiti, he spent some years there. Then he moved back to the United States. And in 1854, the recorded, verifiable history of Muslims in Canada goes back to 1851. So we know about the three Muslims who had come, or the two Muslims who had come from Scotland, a young couple in 1851, and then they had a child here. And in 1854, Muhammad Bakuaqua was also here. So we have another person of Muslim background in Canada, and he was specifically in Chatham, Ontario, in the town of Chatham in southern Ontario. And this was, again, along the route of the Underground Railroad, which is why a lot of Black history in Canada is in that region of southern Ontario. And it was here, and I think this is a very inspiring thing, and something that we should all sort of pay attention to, that Bakuaqua's ultimate goal after being in this position where he was no longer enslaved was to return home to West Africa, which was generally the goal of many of the enslaved West Africans, to go home, which was West Africa for them. But he chose to take a year of his life and spend it in Chatham, Ontario. So the year of 1854, he was in Chatham, actually telling his story to somebody who was writing it down. And this became the autobiography, the slave narrative, as the genre is known, of Muhammad Bakuaqua, which you can still read. It's publicly available if you Google it online. And he describes all the struggles he went through as a young person enslaved in Brazil, and then afterwards in the United States, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere. And it was from Chatham that that narrative was taken to Detroit, where it was published. and then it became part of the genre, which actually ultimately helped abolish slavery in the United States. And we know Bakuaqua himself most likely returned to Canada on his way back to the UK. He was last known to have been present in Liverpool in the UK, and we don't know if he ever made it back to West Africa beyond that. We just don't know where exactly his story ends. And a lot of research has been done in Canada on his story, as well as in Brazil, but particularly the Harriet Tubman Institute at York University in Canada has done a lot of research on this. So definitely read his story, as well as the story of Richard Pierpoint, which has been documented in an excellent book called The Stolen Life. So it's called The Stolen Life. So please do check those resources out. And we can now, after these particular few early glimpses of Black people of Muslim background being present in Canada, we start to move on towards a period of sort of silence in the sources. But as we know from history, there's a general rule to keep in mind always, that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because we don't particularly know of a story, or we don't particularly know of events, of course, doesn't mean they didn't happen. So that being said, the archives are very much full of resources on Black history, and it's just an unexplored topic because, as we mentioned, socially we have this kind of perception that we are a post-racial society, and we don't know the rich history or the very long and tragic history, I should say more appropriately, of slavery in this land, and then of the post-slavery period, the kind of struggles and challenges that Black peoples faced in this land, as well as their resiliency and their excellence in so many areas of life. So those are all stories to pay attention to. I'm going to share one more very interesting story, and then we are going to move on towards the more modern period. Now, this story is a person who I think really needs to be known, along with all of the other people I'm mentioning, of course, but this is such a fascinating story, and there's so many things to learn from it. Of the only known person that I've come across, his name is Muhammad Ali Saeed. And he's the only known person that I've come across who was part of the slave trade that was essentially in North Africa and in Arabia and in the Ottoman Empire, because there certainly was an slave trade that we also as Muslims really need to have a very honest and close look at. And he was part of that, and then he was brought to the Western Hemisphere. So his story is that he's from Central West Africa. He becomes enslaved, and he actually becomes enslaved by sort of these wealthy Turkish people in North Africa. He's taken for Hajj, right? And he's taken then to Istanbul, and from Istanbul he actually gets gifted, and of course this is part of the process of enslavement. He gets gifted to a oligarch of sorts who was from the Russian Empire. So then he goes to Russia and he spends time in St. Petersburg, and then with that oligarchy, now he's a freed man at this point after having gone through all of these travels. He actually travels throughout Europe, and it's incredible the cities he's visiting in the 19th century, and he's taken the name of Nicholas by this time, again to sort of accommodate himself within this world that was not accepting of sort of particularly not of a Black Muslim identity at the time. And he travels throughout Europe, and then finally he's moved along with the people that he's traveling with. He actually goes to the Caribbean and for a brief stay in South America. So I think he's probably the first Muslim in history ever, out of all Muslims, to actually visit 5 continents, right? So he starts in Africa, he goes to Asia, he spends time in Europe, he has a brief period in South America, and then he goes to North America, of course. And he is part of those journeys for a brief time. Again, he's traveling as part of a company of people, and he ends up in Canada. So he goes to Hamilton and Niagara Falls, and then he goes up to Hamilton, to Toronto, to Kingston, to Montreal, and to Ottawa. And then he's, particularly mentions that Ottawa area because at some point he's in a town that he says is a few, 100 kilometers or so north of Ottawa. So that's how far he's come. And that's where the party, they have some differences and they actually abandon him to be on his own. And he really is able to put himself back together on his own with the help of a local church. And they encourage him to actually go back to the United States, travel back through Southern Ontario, go to the United States and seek opportunities there. And then he actually goes on to serve in the American Civil War as well in the mid-1800s. So again, a fascinating story. His narrative is recorded. You can search up Nicholas Saeed, although his full name is Muhammad Ali Saeed, and definitely read that story as well. And with that, we can sort of move towards the modern or relatively modern period of Black Muslim history in Canada. By the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, as we've been discussing, there had been a Black presence in Canada for nearly 300 years at that point. And there had been a Black Muslim presence as well, and we've shared a few stories about that. But now we get into, about a century ago and moving forward towards closer to our own time. So one of the events to keep in mind that had a significant impact on the history of the Black community in Canada as well is what's known as the Great Migration. And that between 1916 and 1970 or so, about 6 million African Americans moved from the rural South trying to escape a sort of the Jim Crow laws that were, in place in the rural South and moved to the northern states. And of course, the northern states brought them closer in proximity to Canada as well. And there was a lot of crossover across the US-American border. And at the same time, as they move from these rural communities and they move towards cities like Chicago and Detroit and New York and other places, they're restructuring their community. And one thing that happens is that in a lot of pockets, this memory that has survived of a distinctly Afro-Islamic identity experiences a revival, right? And this takes the form of movements such as the Moorish Science Temple of America, and the more famous example is the Nation of Islam, as well as the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. And I will mention briefly all of these organizations. And one thing, of course, to keep in mind is that, particularly in the case of the Moorish Science Temple, as well as the Nation of Islam, these are essentially pseudo-Islamic movements in the sense that their beliefs and their practices weren't necessarily aligned with traditional Orthodox Islamic beliefs, but they did retain that some elements of an Islamic identity and try to revive that and form a movement around that. So the Nation of Islam in particular, we know it found some following within Canada, as well as other Black organizations and movements later on, including the Black Panther Party for some time also had in the 1960s, especially some presence in Canada, but these movements never really took off. The more prominent one, which had sort of an indirect relation with Islam, was UNIA, and it was led and founded by Marcus Garvey, who you should definitely look up and read about. And the UNIA had many chapters, more than a dozen chapters in the 1920s and 1930s, and even beyond that across Canada. And one of them actually was in Kensington Market in downtown Toronto, a very long-lasting and important chapter of the UNIA. And in the 1922 convention of the UNIA, one of the things that was seriously discussed among the members, although it was sort of a pan-black movement or a pan-African movement in a sense. One of the things that was discussed is making Islam the official religion of the movement. So that tells us something about the kind of Islamic identity and the memory of Islamic roots that was still preserved up until that point in the broader black community as well. Of course, this never ended up materializing, and Islam was never the official religion of the UNIA, but there are many connections, and this is one of them, to Islam. So we kind of get a sense that even in the Canadian chapters of the UNIA, although we can't say anything for certain, there may have been the Afro-Islamic identity and memory coursing through the different chapters in Canada as well, and perhaps there were some Muslims involved as well, or people from pseudo-Islamic movements who were taking part in this kind of revival of black culture and this movement. And just a quick example to share with you is the parents of Malcolm X. And one of the things that is often forgotten about Malcolm X is that his parents actually met in Montreal in 1917 when they were studying there. And they got married in Montreal in 1919 before later on they moved back to the United States, and Malcolm was born in 1925. And so with these movements, they sort of paved the way for this core group of the Muslim community, which is the black Muslims, to preserve some aspect of an Islamic identity and make their way back towards traditional and orthodox Islam. So we know the examples from later on of Malcolm X, of Muhammad Ali, of Imam Warithin Muhammad, and many others, right? And that is essentially the information we have from the time about what kind of black Muslim presence and activity there may have been in Canada. And it's really not until the 1950s and the 1960s and American or African American Muslims coming up to Canada and leaving their marks in different ways here as well, that we really start to see a development of the black Muslim community, something to speak of as such. So the first example is obviously of Malcolm X, right? And he was here in Canada just a few weeks before he was assassinated. In fact, the last full-length interview on television that he ever gave was given here in Canada to a Canadian television channel. And he made 2 visits in the months preceding his assassination. And he met the Muslim community, the fledgling Muslim community in Toronto at the time, the Muslim Society of Toronto. He met the members, and many of them are still alive, and they have fond memories of that. And, Malcolm coming to Canada was, he was the first real Muslim media personality to go on Canadian television shows, to go on the CBC, for example, and really describe to the broader Canadian audience, using his, of course, very charismatic style, using his very articulate approach, tell them what Islam is. And of course, this is after his Hajj, when he had returned to, mainstream Islam. And then Muhammad Ali is another great example. He, again, it's often forgotten that when he was stripped of his heavyweight championship for refusing to participate in the draft for the Vietnam War. And when he was banned from boxing in the United States, he would come up to Canada to box. And he had a famous fight with George Chuvalo, who was one of the famous Canadian boxers at the Toronto Maple Leaf Gardens. And then they had a rematch in 1972, and Muhammad Ali would often come up to Canada. And again, Canada had a much smaller Muslim community, and it was a boost for the local Muslim community as a whole to have these sort of larger than life Muslim personalities from the United States coming to Canada and really boosting the spirit and morale of the local community here. And in 1984, Muhammad Ali actually made a visit to Edmonton, Alberta, to Canada's first mosque, to the Al-Rashid Mosque, which was established in 1938. And there's pictures of this available online of his visit, and of young children that later went on, young children who Muhammad Ali met at the Al-Rashid Mosque, who later went on to become very prominent members of the Muslim community, as well as of Canadian society as a whole, as well as the elder generation, those who had established that mosque. The whole community as a whole, really enjoyed Muhammad Ali's visit. And as I mentioned, he had two actual bouts here as well, in Toronto, and then in 1972 he had one in Vancouver. So these kind of examples of these cross-border interactions of Black Muslims flowing freely between Canada and the United States, between Canada and also parts of the Caribbean, are very important for us to piece together, to really bring together the narrative of Black Muslim history in Canada, and hopefully open up further areas of research as well. And in the 1960s, we start to see the immigration policies in both the United States as well as in Canada really start to open up and become more of an open door policy. So this is when a larger wave of migration of people from the Caribbean, from the United States, and also Black people from parts of Africa start to come into Canada as well. And of course, this had happened much before, and again, generally speaking, in Black history. So for example, in 1909, between 1909 and 1911, about 1,500 African Americans from Oklahoma moved into Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. So 1,500, not an insignificant number for its time, and they became sort of the founding community, the founding Black Muslim the Black community, which may have included Muslims in the prairie provinces of Canada. And of course, there's Africville as well in Nova Scotia. There may have been some Black Muslim presence there, certainly a Black presence. That's also something to learn about. So the kind of picture I'm trying to paint here is very incomplete, and there's a lot to fill in, which is why it's so important for Muslim researchers, I feel especially, to take a lead in trying to uncover these stories, like I mentioned earlier, and really start to fill in the gaps in our knowledge of Black Muslim history in Canada. But as the open door immigration policy developed, we started to find more Muslims, Black Muslims making their way into Canada, starting families, setting up communities, etc. And of course, one of the famous examples that the people watching this particular video would be familiar with is Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick, who came to Toronto in 1970 and embraced Islam here. And for the past 50 years, mashallah, tabarakallah, he has been a person who has taught and led and inspired the Muslim community, not just in Canada and the United States, but in many different parts of the world, and he continues to do so. Right, so he's one example of a person who's made an enormous contribution as a Black Muslim in Canada. Another famous example is the person Abdullah Sabri, Master Abdullah Sabri, I should say, who came in the 1980s, for example, and he is I don't even know exactly, he's a master of Taekwondo. Let's leave it at that. I encourage you to look up his credentials in that field. But there's many people, and he's worked with local communities, much like Imam Siraj Wahaj, for example, in the United States, has worked with local communities and inspired communities in Canada. But Master Abdullah Sabri has worked with local communities, teaching martial arts, teaching self-defense, and really also teaching in the process self-discipline and self-development to young people. And if you search his name, you'll find many testimonials of young Muslims who have been inspired and taught by him. And you have people who came later on, and athletes especially. I can't finish this video, although he only spent about 2 years in Canada, without mentioning my favorite basketball player of all time, which is Hakeem Olajuwon, who played for the Toronto Raptors. And there are people who have met him when he was here in 2001 and 2002, met him at Jumu'ah, and the Muslim community was, again, growing at a very slow sort of pace. And these people, the black Muslims, were often taking positions of leadership and positions of inspiring Muslims as a general group, and inspiring society as a whole, right? So many of the examples I've mentioned have done that kind of work. And it's important, I think, before I move into one very particular story that I want to go into some detail, it's important for us to be very mindful of, as we try to learn Black Muslim history, to start locally, within your own masjid, within your own family, within your own community, within your circle of friends. Who are the Black Muslim elders? Who are the people who have been here and have been working on the ground and have inspired others and led this community as a whole, right? And we'd be surprised by some of the incredible stories that we can find just within the people around us if we actually take the time to sit down with them and express our appreciation for them and learn their stories from them. So this is something I definitely encourage Muslims across Canada to try to do as much as possible. And with that, I'm going to move into what's probably going to be the final story I share in this session, which is, I think, a story that's very important to keep in mind, that's very inspiring, and that is the story of Dr. Afua Cooper, who I mentioned earlier as well, but we'll go into a bit more detail now. So the final story that I want to end off this session with, and of course there's many other stories that could be told, and many other stories, like I mentioned before, that should be uncovered and I'm certain are there, and hopefully, inshallah, we can play a role in uncovering them and learning from them and sharing them with others. But this particular story is very inspiring for me. It's the story of Dr. Afua Cooper. Dr. Afua Cooper came from Jamaica to Canada in the early 1980s, and it was here when, as a student, she embraced Islam in 1988 in Toronto. And in 1989, she was a master's student at the University of Toronto, and the Royal Ontario Museum actually had an exhibition running that year in 1989 that was called Into the Heart of Africa. And this title of the exhibition alludes to a book, a novel that was written, Into the Heart of Darkness, a while ago, several decades earlier, which was sort of part of this cultural material that was justifying the exploitation by European colonialists of Africa. And so, first of all, the title was sort of problematic, but the way that the exhibition was set up was also deeply problematic. So as a young master's student and a young Muslim, Dr. Afua Cooper went to the ROM, and she went to the ROM several times that year. And ultimately what she started doing was, I suppose, leading these sort of tours for university students, taking them to the ROM, and of course there was certain things on display, but she was pointing out the problematic elements of it. And this situation escalated, very significantly, and it became a point of reflection in Canada. And again, at the time as well, Canada was imagined by many people to be a post-racial society, a society in which these kind of racial challenges did not occur, but the students, most of whom were black students, including Dr. Afua Cooper, they were banned from entering the ROM, and then they started to picket across from the ROM on the weekends, and eventually there were some altercations. The situation escalated. People's houses were graffitied. Like, this was a real situation that developed in 1989 and into 1990 in Toronto, to the point that there were SWAT teams that were standing guard in front of the ROM, And we have pictures of young students protesting against the ROM for running this very deeply problematic and racist exhibition about Africa. And much of that movement was led by Dr. Afua Cooper. And then the following year, this was sort of how she rose to prominence. She was also a young poet, and she's been a groundbreaking poet in many ways, in particular forms of poetry. And in 1990, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and he made his visit to Canada in June of 1990, there was a gathering at Queen's Park in Toronto of about 25,000 people. And one of the speakers who was invited to speak, it was a celebratory gathering at Queen's Park, and one of the people who was invited to speak was Dr. Afua Cooper. So she spoke at that event and she recited her poetry at that event. And then over the years, she's gone on to be a pioneer of Black studies in Canada, and also to be a pioneering and groundbreaking scholar on the history of slavery in Canada. And if you recall, I mentioned her book, The Hanging of Angelique, at the beginning of this session, and strongly recommend that to all of you, that we read it. And she, has become a sort of mainstay among the Black scholarly community, as well as the Black grassroots movement across Canada, in particular due to her, artistic expression, due to her poetry, and she's also a very prominent professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax. And just a few years ago, she was named the Poet Laureate of Halifax, which is sort of, essentially the official poet of the city, so to speak. And so she has had many, positions, and she has taken many strong positions over the last 30 years and beyond within Canada that have developed very important conversations in Canada, that have developed very important artistic forms that many people now utilize to express themselves. And she's also developed Black Studies, which is, the session that we've been doing, that I've been doing and you've been listening to, is essentially a glimpse, a scratching of the surface, just one entry point into Black studies in Canada. And there's so much more to learn, there's so much more to explore, there's so much more that's yet to be uncovered. And inshallah, moving forward, like I've said, we can play a role in that. Now, obviously, I could potentially bring the history of Black Muslims in Canada right up to the present, to 2020. I won't go into that simply because of the growth of the community and how many stories there suddenly emerge after the turn of the century into the 21st century that we could be telling. But again, like I mentioned earlier, look around you, look into your community, look into your circles, learn those stories, and let's appreciate those stories together. So with that conclusion, I hope this session has provided you with some food for thought, that it's reminded all of us of the need to be educated and informed about Black history and Black Muslim history in Canada, but in North America more broadly. That it's going to inspire you to kind of continue your own searching and digging and your own research, and especially to young scholars who are looking at different areas of research that they might want to go into. There's a lot of material that is there to be researched and reviewed and written about on Black Muslim history and Black history. So please look in that direction as well. And in general, I hope that when we see conversations around us about the many forms of systemic racism that persist in the societies in which we live, the many forms of racism that persist within our own communities, within the Muslim community, that we are very sensitive that there's a particular history behind what we see today, and it's up to us to educate ourselves about that very long history and that very complex history to make more informed decisions and hopefully move forward in a much better way, inshallah. So with that, I am going to wrap this session up. I thank the organizers and the team that has put this series and this session together. May Allah reward them. Thank you all for listening. Jazakumullahu khairan. And hopefully, if you find yourself really interested and you want to explore this concept in more detail, my name is Hassam Munir. You can find me on social media. Please feel free to reach out. I can point you out to further resources and things of that sort. And hopefully we can continue our learning journey together, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.